Hey everybody, welcome to a special edition of the Big Liberty Show as I bring you a debate, another rumble in the liberal jungle here on the Big Liberty Show. I'm your host, Big Daddy Liberty. Welcome. And we're going to have a very lively one as we unpack various topical issues through various different ideological lenses. I've been advocating for a while on the show that we can't be an echo chamber. You actually need individuals from the various side of the political spectrum to give input and share ideas and give their views as to what they think that we say here on the Big Liberty Show and at the IRR, and of course generally in the world of media, which in and of itself deserves a little bit of criticism, and I hope we'll do exactly that on this show. Without much further ado, just a quick reminder that you can support the work that your favorite fat boy does over here by becoming a friend of the IRR. This is our crowdfunding campaign, which essentially sees you, the person who wants to support the show, donating 90 Rand a month, and you can do that either by SMSing your name to 32823. An SMS will cost you 1 Rand and terms and conditions to apply, or hey, find us online. Maybe you're one of the tech-savvy ones. Well, then find us online at irr.org.za/join. And as I said, you can throw a few of them shekels my way, 3 or 4 cups of coffee that you would spend ordinarily in a month. And those funds go a long way in supporting the work that I do here, and of course my colleagues at the Institute of Race Relations. Speaking about colleagues, friends, and communists, I have in studio a special lineup of individuals. In fact, I've positioned them strategically to have a visual representation of exactly what we're going to be discussing and how we're going to be discussing our topics here. Let me first greet my absolutely new guest, who I'm hoping in a way will also become a regular on the show, because we do need that different voice. I'm talking, of course, about Andrew. I'm going to butcher your surname. How do I actually pronounce it?
I pronounce it Craucamp. Really
Craucamp. It's Andrew Craucamp, of course, who is from Durban, originally from Johannesburg. Welcome home. And Andrew is a red in tooth and claw communist. So please look out for some interesting, lively discussion and debate here today. I think it's going to be really, really lit, as the young ones say. But Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Awesome. Andrew, before I get to the other guys, just very quickly, who are you, where are you from, and your ideological leanings?
Okay, as you pointed out, I grew up in Joburg, went to school here. I studied information systems engineering out of school. I worked as a software developer for 6 years. I started my own company in 2012, worked on that for another 6 years. Mm-hmm. And I then sold my shares, and I'm now an investor. Awesome. Dude, please welcome to the show. And of course, some regular faces, some you recognize from other iterations of the show, such as The Daily Friend and Blacks Only, which remember comes to you on every Tuesday at 4. Excuse me. Gabriel Crouse.
We do hang out a lot.
Nicholas, of course, who's the other half of his show, Two Crickets in a Thorn Tree. Gabriel Crouse. G, how you doing, Holmes?
I'm good, Sihle.
Good to see you, man.
Thank you so much for inviting me into this one.
Absolutely, dude. Good to be on the same show as you again. And of course, last but not least, the resident anarchist, the fella who says it all, Mpiyakhe Dhlamini. Mpiyakhe, how are you doing?
I'm good, man. And how are you?
Awesome, brother. Good to have you on the Big Liberty Show. And again, good to have you, dear viewer, on the show. Guys, we're going to have a bit of a rumble in the jungle, a bit of a debate/discussion, but it's not going to be the traditional boring debate, formal this and that. No, we're going to be discussing things through various current topical stuff that's been happening in the news cycle, so that you can be part of the conversation and not be left behind. But before I do that, because Andrew is my special guest and he is very much new to the show, and we haven't had a communist on the show, I'm going to give Andrew an opportunity just to give an opening 2 minutes. Andrew, I don't know how long.
A little over 3.
Okay, 3 minutes. Hopefully it'll be engaging. Do not fall asleep. I'm watching y'all. But yeah, Andrew, take it away, and I think we'll take it from there in terms of the conversation, the ebb and the flow. Andrew, Perfect. Talk to us.
I'm sorry, I'm going to read this, but hopefully we can get more engaging afterwards. I just need to set the foundations.
No problem. Before you do, maybe just for the viewers' sake, Andrew and I have been having ongoing debates on social media. So that's also the context in which perhaps a lot of this will be framed. And the real question Andrew poses to me a lot is, what is a socialist and what is a communist, and the charge being I often mischaracterize them. So I'm hoping the opening 3 minutes, we'll also go into that, and then we'll discuss it as a panel. Andrew, the floor is literally yours.
Thank you. Okay, firstly, I need to state the obvious that I represent my own ideas and principles, and over the years I've concluded that my principles tend to align very closely with communism, to a point where I'm quite comfortable calling myself a communist. I'd also like to mention that my perspective is constantly evolving, and I'm certainly open to having my political position changed with sufficient reasoning. But it's because of the fact that I'm constantly questioning my own position that I've landed where I am now. Believe it or not, 10 years ago I was very much in support of libertarian principles. I was also lulled by the allure of the invisible hand. In the interest of having a healthy debate and avoiding the trap of arguing semantics, I'd like to clearly define some concepts. First and foremost, communism. Communism is the egalitarian ideal where both the state and the private sector are merged and society is owned and managed by the electorate through a completely democratic and decentralized process. A side note, representative democracy is a facade. It's not real democracy. We need direct democracy or liquid democracy at least. An obvious prerequisite to communism is that the level of general education needs to be raised to a point where the electorate are able to make healthy decisions that positively impact everyone. I work both with rural and well-educated people on a regular basis of all races, and I stand with conviction that practically every human being has the potential to reach a sufficient level of informedness to make generally good decisions.
Andrew, no worries. We're just going to quickly scold Mpiyakhe there. Guys, phones on silent, but Andrew, yes, you're saying?
I'd also like to point out that a high level of general education is also required for the free market ideal because people essentially vote with their wallets. We have a huge distortion in value in society today because people vote for prestige instead of actual value. And that's obviously a byproduct of the class system. Diamonds are a good example of this, but there are many. Back on the topic of communism, it's important to note that communism is an ideal itself. It's not a socio-economic strategy to reach an ideal. As a systems engineer and a self-proclaimed expert on the bond between technology and ethics, I have some ideas on how to achieve communism, but really it needs to be a concerted effort. One person or a small group of people are not going to cut it, and that's really the point of communism. Decentralization technologies are at the core of my solutions. Hopefully I can elaborate on that later. But before we can engineer a strategy to reach the ideal, we all need to agree that it's the right decision to work towards. Essentially, communism comes down to democracy and equality, and surely everyone but the 1% agrees that democracy and equality are things to strive for. Secondly, I'd like to define what I mean when I talk about the left-right political spectrum. The conservative right that want to maintain an existing culture that was hard fought for versus the progressive left that are in the process of trying to pull society into a better future. I see the right see the left as a threat to a comfortable world which they've built for themselves, and the left see the right as an anchor preventing us from moving forward with new ideas. The left and right appear to be in a perpetual double helix. What I mean by that is both ends of the political spectrum gradually evolve into each other over time. So Sihle, that's what I mean when I say the ANC and the EFF are not left anymore. Progressives worked hard against the legitimate enemy to change an inhumane status quo, and they set a new status quo, and true to their new right-wing alignment, they will defend that at all costs. But let's be very clear, the Malema camp and the Trump camp are on the same side of the coin. They are fascist, racist nationalists. The fact that they fight amongst each other along racial lines has nothing to do with us on the other side of the coin.
All right. Interesting points raised there. I think a lot of them hit themes, that we're going to be discussing here in any event. A lot of it shaking already in the panel. So let's maybe take some. I'm going to put some of these points that Andrew made to you lads. Before I give my input, perhaps, just some of the direct areas where we've had a conflict before. Guys, the big elephant in the room, therefore, Andrew almost concluded with, around the ANC and the EFF. They are not leftist, they are not communist, is the claim. Guys, is Andrew right, is he wrong? Gabriel?
Right. I think that Andrew's tried to lay out the terms in a way that is super clear, in order to avoid a semantic debate. But the problem is that we all use these words left and right, and I don't think that most people use those words in that way. So let's say there's left and right, where left means different to what's currently the case, and right means this reinforcing the status quo. In that case, yeah, it does fall out of that definition that the ANC is now right-wing, and that the EFF as a sort of junior league that's sort of been slightly outsourced of the ANC is likewise in the same position. But there's another way of looking at left and right, which is what kind of scope do you think government should be? This is a much more normal way to talk about it. And their left means we want the government to get bigger, we want the government to take more charge of the economy, to intervene more directly in people's lives. And the right says, no, we would like the government to intervene less. Maybe as little as a night watchman state, where the government's only function should be to have laws about property rights and sort of protecting people from externalities, third-party effects, of which you might define murder as a third-party effect. You know, it's like you haven't voluntarily contracted into that deal. Someone comes and hijacks your car. And so you have laws about protecting people from being robbed of their lives or their goods. And then you have police that enforce those laws, judges that adjudicate when the laws have been broken or not. That would be sort of the as right-wing as you could get in this definition. Without going completely towards anarchism.
Well, on that, a quick bookmark. That's actually how I positioned you guys in terms of the seating arrangement. How that's just to reciprocate my understanding is that, you know, obviously I placed Andrew on what I perceive to be the left, big government, the role of essentially a collectivist ideal, to what I assume and I posit, and again I'm open to being corrected or rather a pushback, a centrist position, which is, you know, sort of liberalism, classical liberalism, or centre right, no matter how you want to view that, and of course on the far end of that spectrum, to an extent, an anarchist position, which basically sees no role for the state. But sorry, I took the bookmark out.
Good. So I think that's in that definition, this sort of economic one of left-wing or right-wing, it's clear that the ANC is left-wing. It's clear that the EFF is even more left-wing. And I think that it's a real problem. And I'd like to say it's a real problem in quite a particular way. Francis Fukuyama, I think, is the most famous economist to have visited South Africa this year. He made a speech at WITS, which I thought was very insightful. And what he said was, look, and partly he was famous because he predicted the fall of the Soviet Union at a time when a lot of elite pundits sort of thought that it would carry on for a very long time. Much like perhaps today, when you hear the ANC, when you hear from the Institute's polls that it doesn't look like the ANC can survive for very long, a lot of people just are like, well, it's been around for so long, surely it'll continue forever. If it does fall, it'll take a lot of people by surprise. Anyway, Fukuyama came here to say that one reason to be suspicious of the left-right divide in this economic sense as being particularly useful is that different governments have different capacities. So he said, if you're in a country whose government is really, really capable and really, really efficient, maybe it's not such a bad thing for government spending to be 50% of GDP. Look at Denmark, look at Sweden, I don't know. Look at these sort of famous lefty Scandinavian states. The government participates a lot in the economy, it intervenes a lot, and yet living standards are high, and economic growth continues to happen, so that's okay. But there are other countries where the governments are not capable of doing that. In South America, in the 70s after the oil collapse, very few of the South American countries were willing to take austerity seriously, to shrink their size of their government, and instead many of them collapsed, and that created terrible social strife, created a lot of murder, created a lot of sort of opportunistic race baiting. Whereas in East Asia, countries like South Korea, Singapore, they said, look, we're spending more money than we're taking in. It's not working anymore. We need to stop doing that. So let's shrink the size of the government. And what happened as a result is a massive upliftment of poverty, a massive increase in productivity, a massive increase in the capacity for ordinary people to accumulate wealth and prepare a better future for their children. So Fukuyama said, dude, figure out what country you're in before you stick to a mere leftist position or a mere rightist position. And in South Africa, we have one of the most incapable governments in the world. It is rife with corruption. It is rife with rent seeking. It is rife with all the kinds of abuses of poor people that you can possibly imagine. And yet, in 2019, we have the new dawn of socialism, of communism. We have an increase in the government's intention to intervene in the health market through NHI. We have an increase in the government's intention to regulate prices through price fixing on data. We have an increase in the intention of the government to set where you as an investor may put your assets through prescribed assets. We have an increase in the intention of the government to own land. Almost 20 million South Africans sleep on state-owned land. They cannot invest in their homes in order to increase their asset base. The government doesn't want less of that. It wants more of that. And yet, the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform is so corrupt that the Kgalema Motlanthe high-level panel report found it to be the root cause, well, the primary problem at the moment, inhibitor of land reform. And the Constitutional Court, 2 months ago or so, found that the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform is so corrupt that it cannot be run by the democratic process, and the court has to appoint a special master to effectively be the Minister of Land Reform to try and save that process from getting even worse. And yet, the ANC and the EFF, which you say are right-wing and are trying to maintain the status quo, are trying to increase the amount of land that the government has without paying compensation to people on the other side. And the result is capital flight, higher unemployment, and so on.
So, a quick summation before I come to you, Mpiyakhe. A switch then, and I'll come back to you, Andrew, to see if you accept it, in how we define left and right, to a more common, what I also thought was a commonly understood interpretation of it. Mpiyakhe, your opening thoughts?
Yes. So I think Gabriel has adequately dealt with this left and right wing issue, because the definitions themselves must have some content. They mustn't be. They mustn't change. Like they mustn't. It mustn't be. You mustn't have a certain situation where you have someone proposing small government and you have someone proposing big government, and both of them are considered to be on the right because the default in that society had been whatever that person is proposing. And so I think that Gabriel has dealt with that. What I wanted to deal with was because Andrew started out well by sort of defining his terms, setting out his values. I wanted the two main values that he mentions are democracy and equality. Now, depending on how you define democracy and how you define equality, these two values might actually contradict each other in a lot of the times. So, for example, if your definition of democracy is something like a consensus-based system, then I guess you could have equality in that. It's possible that you could have equality without contradiction in that system. But if your system is based on majoritarianism, where the majority decides, and then you by definition, then you don't have the equality, because the minority will always be will have to yield to the whim of the majority. So I would like the clarification on that. Yeah.
All right, Andrew. Wonderful opening statements by everybody. I wasn't intending on there being opening statements per se, but I think it was quite good. It was quite good in terms of setting out a rebuttal to some of the points you were making, but also request for clarity. So, Andrew, I'm going to give you an opportunity just to respond before I start peppering everybody with questions to some of the themes that were brought up here. Your thoughts?
Okay, so yeah, I'm very much, and I feel most communists feel this way. I could be wrong, but I'm very much of the idea that we need to get rid of the state. That's one of the basic definitions of communism. We need to get rid of the state, and the people need to run the country. Again, we're talking about an ideal, so we're looking at how the world should be, and getting there, yes, we're very far away from it, particularly in this country. You mentioned the Scandinavian countries. I think there's some good examples over there. They were playing around with ideas of universal basic income and that sort of thing.
Fellas, just a quick reminder, speaking to the mics, please. So everybody can hear us. Yep.
You spoke about the issue of the how I describe it as the uneducated majority overwhelming the educated minority, which is definitely a problem that we need to worry about with communism. And the way to overcome that is with improving general education. And it really needs to be general education. We can't have a small group of well-educated people, essentially acting as the superheroes of society.
Sorry to interrupt, but educated people can disagree among themselves.
Yeah. Often, when the more educated you get, the
Exactly.
more you realize how much disagreement there is.
Exactly.
No, and yeah, there's a lot of disagreement. And
I disagree that you should be allowed that apple.
at the end of the day,
and 4 guys agree with me. Okay, I'm going to have that apple.
at the end of the day, democracy rules, and the majority situation, democracy decides how we run our society, and we just need to motivate our rationale and explain why we feel this is the way society should be.
Perhaps then is the first question, and this will be open to everybody, and I think I'm going to ride off of Mpiyakhe's line of inquiry, is where does your conception leave the individual? In other words, if I have an individual desire to make as much money as I possibly can in servicing a particular community. So I'm a young entrepreneur in Khayelitsha. The state runs healthcare in that part of the world, in fact, in most parts of South Africa. But I spot a gap, right? So I say, hey, older people can't get their medicines because they can't make it to the clinic on days when they're supposed to get their meds. Their meds, yeah, sorry. I then start a business where a few friends of mine, we ride around on our bicycles, delivering these meds, and we charge people money to do this, even though the meds themselves are quote-unquote free because they come from the state. That individual chose to do something which is outside of what the state says it is its responsibility, right? How do you view that situation? Where do you leave that individual who chooses to do something like that? If the majority, as you argue, say he can't do this because the state is already providing the service, do we stop him?
Well, just remember that money is not a part of the communist ideal. State, money, and class is not a part of the communist ideal. So again, the
What do you mean by this?
That's
to clarify?
That's the definition of communism: stateless, classless, moneyless society. So we can talk about how we get to that point. And yeah, the example you made where somebody finds a niche in the market to help society in some or other way, and gathering capital to help that is obviously a good thing. We can take load shedding as an example. It sucks for everyone, but renewable electricity, renewable energy is obviously getting a lot of capital, and that's good for everyone. But we want to get to a point where we, as a society, build a situation where the government, which is run by all of us, not by a small group of people, looks after everyone. You get the power you need, preferably in a decentralized way.
Okay.
I want to say something about this idea of the ideal. It's because there's been an interesting development in political theory, which is nicely captured by Kwame Anthony Appiah, who I think is the best philosopher of race. He's at NYU. He was at Princeton. I studied under him. And his second last book is called The Philosophy of As If. And he really takes John Rawls to task, who's often associated with classical liberalism. And as I'm sort of representing that, I think he does well to take him to task, and communists to task too, for thinking that you can do well by coming up with a theory of how things would be in heaven, and then thinking that that has much application to how things are over here. And sort of the general argument is basically was best made by Alistair Sparks, actually, as a late editor of the Rand Daily Mail, who did more than any other paper, I think, to take out apartheid. Alistair Sparks said, the problem is if someone really thinks they know what heaven looks like, and then on earth, and then they think they know how to bring heaven to earth, you must beware, because what cost would not be worth paying in order to bring heaven onto earth? If I said, I know how to make this society cashless, stateless, everyone's going to be beautifully getting along, but all we need to do is kill one child to bring that along. Surely it's worth it, because the way the system is now, innocent children are dying every day for want of food, for want of technology, for want of, I would say more often than not, the freedom for capitalists like the one you mentioned to get out in Khayelitsha and provide a service without being government regulated. But for whatever the reasons are, right now, innocent kids are dying. So if I had to kill one innocent child to bring that to an end forever, surely it'd be worth it. What if I had to kill 1 million? It would also be worth it, because over the next 100 years, surely more than 1 million innocent children would die. What if I had to kill 6 million, 60 million? Let's go to the gulag. Let's look at actual communists who have gotten actual power. And what have they not done in order to bring their heavenly ideal down to earth. So this is a general warning about the heavenly ideal. But I want to say something sympathetic about the heavenly ideal too. I think we've all lived in cashless, stateless states of being. When you're at the family table, your mother and your father, or your mother and your mother, whatever the case may be, there's no cash there. There's no state there. There's just love and sharing. Africa Burn really is a cashless, stateless kind of society.
I know you're going to bring this up, Gabriel.
And well, I went there. I'll probably be going there again in May. And it's really nice. One of the things to notice about what happens in those rooms, I'd really like to specify particular rooms, the dining room table, the Africa Burn sort of larger denominated by a fence area, is that people get along very nicely. When there are decisions made, it's sort of very consensus based, very little productivity. Very few people are motivated enough by sort of just being liked or prestige outside of the market idea of prestige, to put in the hard hours, to wake up early every morning and take the risks and work really hard in the ways that are necessary to have productivity. So Africa Burn is great. Let's not idealize it too much and think it's worth necessarily getting there. And let's remember that when we do get there, often it's a party with a very big hangover afterwards and not a hell of a lot of value added.
Mpiyakhe, there's an observation made by Gabriel here in pushback to Andrew, and Andrew, I'll give you a chance to come back, that there is a world of a kind that it is. And in that world of a kind that it is, the ideals, lofty as they may be, perhaps not even on our side, are just not applicable. You need to be able to see exactly what you have, figure out how you get yourself from point A to point B in a rational way, if I can bring in Fukuyama's assessment. And you work off that basis, as opposed to assuming that the ideal is something you can impose in your here and now. Your thoughts generally on that, and maybe I put any other pushback on Andrew?
So I don't think there's a problem, and I think Gabriel is not. That's not what Gabriel is saying. Gabriel is saying that the problem with heavenly ideals. And now I do think you can have ideals. I mean, that's why we are some of us are liberals, because there is an ideal that we want to strive towards, so that we think is achievable. But I think the problem becomes what, like Gabriel was saying now, when the ideal becomes the fantastic, and so that happens when you. It just contradicts. It's self-contradictory. It doesn't even just thinking about it. You can't make it work logically. At least at the very least, your ideal should make sense at the level of logic. That's why I believe in asking questions of anyone who proposes anything, including myself. Like I make a lot of proposals to people as well how society should be run, and I welcome the criticism, like the people trying to knock it down. And so going back to what some of this, like for example, Andrew says that he believes in a stateless society, but part of how he gets to his ideal is by having a merger between society and the state. Now, is it not possible that in that measure the state will somehow still survive because of the measure that happens?
That's right.
So what will happen is that, and this fits into my previous question as well, in the sense that because majoritarian democracy is inherently not equal, because you have some people making decisions for everyone else, the minority. So that's you can't make that equal no matter how much you try. And so because of that, and this is what you would believe in. Can't you envision a situation where the majority takes charge of the state during this measure and uses it against the minority or anyone else? And so that would be something to think about. And then in terms of the classless category as well, this fits into the equality thing as well. Equality has not been adequately defined in this discussion so far, because we could mean virtually anything.
Exactly.
I mean, like it could mean so much.
2 equals 2.
Exactly.
Mathematical equality. As long as 2 equals 2, we're free.
So let's just assume for a moment that when you refer to equality and class, you're referring in fact to wealth, how much wealth someone has and all of this. Okay, and then it doesn't. I don't understand how that would be. Like what are we trying to achieve in that? Like why is this desirable? And how does it fit into the bigger idea? Like, why should equality be something we treasure? And so, like this, I guess I have more questions than I have answers. Like, I just want to understand
Andrew,
where the brother man is coming from.
You're hearing the questions come back, and I think there's a lot of pushback on some of the ideals and perhaps the lack of definitions in them. But there is a very important point that Mpiyakhe makes politically. I think you must grapple with. What stops those individuals as you move towards this stateless society? What stops those individuals who assume, presumably, the power of the state initially in order to transition to this from corrupting it? Because the argument might very well be that's been the record of history going back, especially in the 20th century, where people have assumed state power, often calling themselves the vanguard of those they represent, and then with the trappings of power be corrupted and corrupt the entire system and subjugate the less desirables in their society, whoever they may be, the bourgeoisie or whatever.
The 1%.
The 1% in this case. People that, often when we hear leftist rhetoric, there is a determined and a identified opponent. What stops you from corrupting your own notion of the movement towards a stateless society?
So as I said, it's an ideal that we need to work towards, or at least aim towards. How we get there is something we all need to decide together as a collective, and I'm probably not the best person to do it. It seems like both of you have some really good ideas on how we could potentially get there. And absolutely, George Orwell's The Animal Farm, he covers the some are more equal than others problem. And that is a problem with communism. We need to be aware of that. And if we want to get to a point where everybody runs society, we need to find a way to mitigate that risk. But we need to do it as a collective. One person's not going to cut it, as I said. I wanted to mention one of the points that you made. The free market system does work. You gave examples. There are lots of examples. India is also a fantastic example of how the free market was just allowed to, do its thing there, and general general wealth is definitely increasing there, and it's now becoming one of the powerhouses of the world.
Andrew, just remember to speak into the mic.
Sorry,
there's a little bit of an awkward thingy, but yeah.
So it works. The free market system works, but we're ignoring the hidden costs of the free market system. And that often comes down to inhumanity. It comes down to abuse of animals, abuse of the environment in a major way, to the point that the entire world is collapsing. I think no one here disagrees that our ecosystems are collapsing globally. Oh, do you? Okay, we can discuss that more. But I feel there are these hidden costs because it's profit driven, because we are, we're not taking that into account. It's easy to push costs off into the things that don't have a say, such as the animal industry. Communism. Okay, you spoke about the room situation. The example I always give is communism works in a small village, but it's difficult to scale that up to a society. And yes, I agree. Communism should be a global thing. I actually think it's inevitable. We're going to reach a point where we achieve the communist ideals, but we may not call it communism, but we're definitely working towards there. We're getting more and more decentralized technologies going. More people are getting politically involved. We're breaking down this idea of the heroes, the superheroes and the leaders.
Sorry, just a quick question. If communism works best in small rooms or in small communal sense, how does it become global?
I don't know. That's for us to figure out how to scale it up. I've got some ideas. For example, AI and robotics are just absolutely important. We need to push labor off, and we as human beings need to be, the ideas and the thinkers. By AI, I mean data analysis, automated data analysis. The AI needs to step in and tell us, okay, if we take this decision, it's going to lead us down that road. If we take that decision, it's going to lead us down that road. And then we as people need to say, okay, this is the way we want to go. This is what we vote for.
I hear a lot of this we as people thing, but I still haven't heard how, if there is an individual or a small group of people who disagree, and this comes back to a point that we made around what happens when you have a vanguard and a grouping who disagree with the vanguard. What stops the vanguard from essentially using force to stifle, suppress, kill off, or whatever descriptor you want to use, those group of individuals who disagree with the direction of the majority?
Well, you can't have a vanguard. Then it's not communism. And that's the example of the USSR and China. They want to call themselves communist, but they never got there. They didn't even get close. In fact, they went in the opposite direction.
But hang on, doesn't contradict your very point then that there is a pathway to that communist ideal?
Yes, absolutely.
And historically it's been this way, and if you're saying it doesn't work, then how do you reach that communist ideal? Like, it seems like you don't have that
plan.
pathway.
But that's not my role. My role is to advocate the ideal, and then for us to come together as a collective and find a way to get
Fellas?
So let's grant you, for the sake of argument, that we can establish the usefulness of an ideal. And by ideal, I want to draw the distinction between the classical liberal ideal and this communist ideal. The classical liberal ideal is what we should value. It's not how things look.
Yeah.
It's not a utopian description of the heavenly state. So let's pair apart whether you can describe the heavenly state from whether you need some avenue to getting there, which problem granted is that maybe getting there becomes more costly than it could possibly be worth it. Let's just look at if human beings are the kinds of things that could, if we did somehow get to this state where there's no government, there's no money, would we stay there? Is that a stable state? Is that a thing that's going to reinforce itself? Or is it like a chicken egg on top of a triangular roof? Any little gust of wind blows and it's going to topple down one way, topple down another way, and create a big mess. I think a reason to think that even if you did get to this heavenly ideal situation, it wouldn't last is because of violence. And I would like to hear about your theory of violence. My theory of violence is that if you get enough people, if you get a sampling of enough people, you're going to find 5% are psychopaths, basically.
Wow.
They are going to, and call it 1%, call it whatever percentage you want to call it. But there are people who do not take the classical liberal idea seriously. They do not value other people per se as a thing that's important in itself. They just see everyone else as a tool to increasing their own happiness. And that means they'll take a gun to your head and they will pull the trigger if that's going to make them happier. If that's not going to mean they get caught and they go to jail and so on and so forth. So if I'm right that wherever you have people, you have some people that are going to be willing to hurt others, to force others to make them happier. If you have no state, it sounds like you have no system of punishing those people, of catching those people, of having rules by which those people can be judged. It sounds like all you have is an idea shared that we don't, most of us don't really like it. And if someone does it, well, we hope that they get caught and we hope that something happens to them. So I think that's when I hear stateless society, I hear no means of reproach for violence.
Before I come to Mpiyakhe, I also want, there's a key point that Mpiyakhe wanted you to get into, your definition of equality. What exactly do you mean? Because often we argue
outcomes or inputs.
Yeah, essentially. How do you define your sense of equality?
I'd actually like to hear Mpiyakhe's definition of equality first before I give mine. Is that okay?
Well, I have many, like, you mean the equality that I value?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, what would you define?
I value equality before the law. I mean, there was if whenever we have disputes between two people have disputes among themselves, they should be able to get a fair hearing where the hearing is just on the facts of the case and not of the things that are subjective to that particular individual. So things that have nothing to do with the case itself, but are just things that belong to you, like your identity, for example. So I believe in equality before the law. Now, it doesn't imply other kinds of equality, but that's the equality I think that is not only sustainable, but is the most worthy equality to have.
Right, fellas, just a reminder to speak into the mic. Yeah, your definition of equality then.
Okay, so for me, equality obviously talks about the financial equality, but also racial equality, gender equality. All of those things, every human being is basically a node in the system of equal worth to the system, and our ideals are where we differ. So that's different in today's society, where your background, your genes tend to give you more of a sway in certain situations. So,
quick rebuttal there. How do you deal with that difference? Because it comes back to the issue then of violence.
So let me
maybe go into that.
Speak about what he brought up. So the psychopath situation, I tend to disagree with that. I think the system we've built is it encourages that kind of behavior, especially at the CEO level. It encourages that kind of self-serving behavior.
This is very good. So, and it comes back to an earlier point you said when you were openly defining your terms and your commitment to communism. You said one of the problems is that people today buy diamonds because they want the prestige, and that this has been created. And we all know De Beers, the story about how De Beers manufactured an increased desire for diamonds by saying that they're a girl's best friend and they're the thing that you really need to have when you get married, because otherwise the person doesn't really love you. Now, I agree that De Beers did something there. They increased the demand for diamonds around the world. But I don't agree that any political system or any state or lack of a state or any advertiser or lack of a desire invents desire. Desire is something we already have. And I think that one of the basic desires that all people have is for esteem or prestige or the liking of others. That's there without the market system. The market system then just adds it on. And one way you can tell is that people have grown up in systems that weren't market-based systems. There have been communist societies, small and large, in which people pursued esteem. Another thing that people basically pursue is power. Power, I define in this sense as the ability to get other people to do what you want them to do at the issuance of a command. Now, the easiest way to have power is to have a domination of violence over someone else. If I've got a gun to your head and I say, tie your shoelaces, then you're going to tie your shoelaces because the alternative is that I pull the trigger. Another way to get power is to get a lot of esteem first, and someone trusts you. When you say, look, there's a fire, let's pour water, people are like, we trust that guy, we're going to pour water. Often when people respect their parents nicely, it's because their parents have poured in so much love and so much goodwill that when the parents say, dude, I really need you to not do this right now, people obey their parents because they've got power that they've won that kind of way. But all people want power. All people want esteem, and all people want property. They want them to different degrees, but those are the desires that I think empirically we all have. Demonstrably, people who've grown up with wolves have also demonstrably desired these things. Jordan Peterson, who makes a lot of mistakes, he notices that the desire for esteem is so basic that lobsters have it. And that the connection between esteem and power is so basic that lobsters have it. And lobsters are about as far back as any moving, intelligent creature can go, but still be on the same basic tree as us. Monkeys want power. Monkeys want to be like dogs. Come and lick your hands, not because the markets made them do it. They come and lick your hands because they want you to pat them on the head, to be liked. We all want to be liked. The market doesn't invent it, it just frames it. We all want power. And some people, the sociopaths, are just the people who are willing to go all the way. I think that the capitalist system is brilliant when it works well, because it takes a sociopath and it says, dude, if you just want to pursue selfishly your own ends and you're willing to use others as instruments and you don't really care about them in your heart, fine. If you kill anyone or you hurt anyone, you are going to suffer the consequences. So selfishly, you become better. And selfishly, if you really want to be the most admired person in the world, the best way to do it is to make Amazon.
Serve others.
And Amazon is going to serve other people what they want voluntarily. They're going to opt into it. You're going to increase in fame, in glory, in power, in prestige. And you're that sociopath who in another society, a non-market-based society, a non-rules-based society, might have become a genocidal maniac or a small little killer or a torturer or whatever, instead has served a greater good.
So that I think where the conversation is at the moment is, we sort of we boiled it to a concentrated sludge, if you will, where I think you need to answer the following question. In getting us to your society, the ideal, how do you define the use of violence? Because you've argued now that no, there's a stateless society and but there's still power dynamics. There's still, as Gabriel went into, people who desire power and prestige and the like. How do you reconcile the use of violence? Because you described that there's a majority and their wants or desires move the society. I then made the point that, well, classical communist theory tells us that they form a vanguard that represents that ideal, and that has always been corruptible to essentially the use of violence to get those who don't want to go in that direction to follow that. How do you reconcile the use of violence? Before I come to you, Mpiyakhe, you wanted to chip in something?
Oh, sorry, I didn't want something that had been said before to just sort of slip under. But I did want to make the point that my problem is not with I do not agree with Gabriel when he says that a stateless society will always mean that there is no punishment for violence, for example, because I think in the same way as what you describe now, like in how markets allow us to gang up against bullies, in the same you will see the same dynamic. I mean, it's almost a self-regulating system. If someone is enough of a bully, no one wants to work with them, and I've seen this practically in let's say in the taxi industry, where taxi drivers, even though they are basically lawless, the cops can't touch them, but they still have to serve at some basic level the needs of passengers. And the one people they will never try to offend, if you've noticed, is their passengers. So they will offend everyone else, regular road drivers, and make their lives hell. But in terms of their passengers, they will always get without any government forcing them to do so. And so I think you have to consider those things, that violence, society, no one likes, like peaceful people don't like violence. And I think liberalism rests on the assumption that most people want peace. If that is not true, I don't think liberalism itself would be sustainable.
Andrew?
I think it was a mistake of you to bring up the taxi industry, because that's a very good example of how the free market system isn't working, because the moment competition comes into play, they respond with violence. So that brings me to your question, that my personal view is anyone who resorts to violence and destruction is immediately the enemy. Obviously, that's my personal view, and the majority, rules over. But sorry.
But hang on. How does the majority get the minority to accede to what you argue should be the majority's way of doing things without the use of violence? Because it seems like getting to your communist ideal hinges upon answering that question.
Well, we're already getting to the communist ideal, and not through violence. We already have decentralized technologies, like the internet, for example, is a great decentralized technology. There are a couple of good ones, like Bitcoin. I'm sure you support Bitcoin as a free market advocate. It's taking the rule of the monetary system out of central hands and putting it into everybody's hands. It's a mechanism, and there are lots of different technologies that we can implement that slowly bring us towards this ideal, whether we're aware of it or not. We're using the free market system to get there. We're watching the free market system cannibalize itself, and which is opening gaps for decentralized systems. The collapse of Eskom is also a good example. As I brought up earlier, we're now seeing these solar panels go up on all these roofs. That's a decentralization technology. It's letting people look after themselves without having to rely on the government. Do you understand? And that's where it comes from, is technology. But I just want to, before we move on, I want to address the value system that you spoke about. Communism is a value system. I've written a blog post about this. That's what it is. It's what we value in society, and it goes beyond products and scarcity and that sort of thing. We have to value things like peace, and we have to value our planet. You disagree with that, but
no,
I think it's pretty it's pretty conclusive that we're destroying our planet. We need to value that. We need to look after it, and that's what communism is about. It's just implementing these value systems, and I think that's the way to get there.
I just wanted to give an answer to the taxi industry. So the violence in the taxi industry happens for the same reason that it happens in the marijuana industry, that it happened in the USA because of the alcohol prohibition there. And so this is essentially the state incentivizing violence by saying that you can't peacefully resolve your conflicts, telling people that no, whereas before it might have been to your benefit to get a lawyer to sort of mediate or arbitrate between you two. You can't do that because that lawyer will go to jail, so he can't help you. So you have to find some other way to resolve your problem. And that usually involves,
explain
violence.
Why you can't get a lawyer involved?
Because if you get, whatever lawyer you get to sort of arbitrate between you two is committing a crime. So there's a massive disincentive. They could even lose their license as a lawyer. So there's a massive disincentive in order to. There's nothing incentivizing solving problems peacefully, because everyone who participates in helping you solve your problems peacefully, they can just go to jail, and the cost of going to jail for many people far exceeds the cost of letting these problems be faced by some community in Nyanga or Matadeni or somewhere else.
Let me be even more specific. A lot of the violence that is born out of the taxi industry, because we're just using it as an example, is born out of one grouping's frustration that the other group has behind it state coercive manipulative power. So for example, an association is given power by the state to make the rules in the industry. Now if it was about competition, and fair competition, they don't have a problem with that because then it becomes about how you best provide a service, that wins more customers, and essentially the individual who does the best wins. You had a period of that in the taxi industry. I'll use Durban as an example, where people would innovate now to get more customers. So taxis would have loud sound systems to entice the youth and whatever. The taxi driver would be well dressed or flashy. The taxis would have branding. All of that were market behaviors based on competition. But the moment you had associations step in that had state power behind them, and essentially they gave these associations the right to also issue operating licenses, that's when you started seeing the violence. Because effectively, you now can't resolve competition through, you can't resolve market competition through competing with your opponent because the other opponent has an unfair advantage, which comes back, of course, to the question I think I posed to you. In getting to your society, how do you reconcile the issue of one grouping then having power and exercising violence over another? Like, surely you've got to be able to reconcile this in answering the question of whether a communist society is something people want at all.
Well, I don't know. I just can give you the same answer I've given you again. We're slowly getting there. You don't see it that way. We are slowly getting there. And I just also want to mention, as I said before, the free market system works. Competition does work.
Yep.
As I said, I came from a libertarian background.
Yep.
I wanted everything in society to be privatized. Let the free market sort it all out. But the more you pay attention to the free market system, you realize how it encourages lying, cheating, and stealing, whether you like it or not.
How? Maybe
let's go back to the taxi industry. I mean, there's so many industries that are an example of this. There's series on Netflix at the moment which just show you how every single industry eventually evolves into almost a mafia type situation.
I don't want to lose the claim you made. Okay. How does the free market system incentivize lying, cheating, and blah blah blah?
Because it's the same as doping in the sports industry. Those who don't do it are now at a disadvantage because I'm sure you can admit to this. In South Africa, everybody is cheating and stealing and lying.
But how's that a consequence of the free market?
Right? Yeah, because it sounds like you're at a disadvantage if everyone else is lying, cheating, and stealing and not getting punished. But if the market is properly regulated, I'm not into.
But that's
free
a socialist
market
concept.
No,
Regulation is a socialist concept.
No, it's not.
No.
Yes, it is.
Sorry,
Is a socialist concept.
Yes,
I'm
because it's
not
the states intervening.
I'm not sure
government
what you
intervening.
think the etymology of socialism is, but I do think that this is a very, very, very interesting moment.
Yeah.
So, and it speaks to something that I found quite frustrating this year in one of the president's economic advisors. He said of Ivo Factor, who's a writer for the Daily Maverick and associated with the Institute. Yeah. He said Ivo Factor wants no state at all because he's a right winger who wants less of a state. And that idea comes from America. It comes from the Tea Party. The Tea Party sort of took libertarianism, and there are two versions of libertarianism. There's a sort of Ayn Rand version of libertarianism, which says you may never initiate force. And so basically we need a stateless society, no laws, no rules, kind of everyone just being on the defensive. Very decentralized. And there's another version of libertarianism, which has it that what the state's role is to be a night watchman state, that private property is... You can you can see everything through the lens of private property, and that you need rules before which everyone is equal in their application to those rules to punish others who break those rules. And you have a police force, you have an army to make sure that external actors don't do it, and then you have to have judges, police, army, borders, and tax collectors to pay for the lot of it. So regulations by that version of libertarianism, and that version of libertarianism is the older. Is very much not a socialist idea. In fact, you can go back, you can trace this through to John Locke, you can trace this through to Cicero, to Seneca, you can trace this back all the way to the ancient Greeks. Their thought of having a rules-based system where everyone appeals to the rules so that if you steal my stuff, I can say why it was my stuff in the first place, how it is that you got caught, and why it is that you should be punished. That's a regulation. That's the most basic regulation. And all regulations fall out of that. In terms of the problem with socialist regulations, the problem with sort of how the taxi industry, part of how it's run, part of how healthcare is run, how so much of land reform is run, is that you have government officials that aren't properly applying the rules. Part of the problem with the sort of financial crisis in America was that you had dudes not applying the rules properly, and when they do go and levy the fines against Goldman Sachs for deliberately selling people, they lied, cheated, and stole, right? And that cost us as South Africans a lot too. It cost the whole world. When they get caught, they get fined less than the profits that they made out of those particular deals. That's a failure of the regulations. I think we agree.
Yes.
We should agree that I think we should all agree, myself, and I do feel like I'm sitting between two people who don't necessarily agree, that violence is something that people are always going to appeal to try and get ahead. And what you need is a system of rules with incentives for judges and police and whatever to manage those rules so that it's always more of an advantage to be honest. It's always more of an advantage to add value to society. And when you see a so-called capitalist system where people are getting ahead by lying and cheating and stealing, I say that's a failure of regulation. And the most common way for regulations to fail is for those who are already very wealthy to buy a few politicians to create bad regulations or corrupt the regulatory system to their own advantage.
Just a correction that Ayn Rand believes that you need a state, but her version of a state is basically sort of a state that reacts automatically to the violation of rights somewhere, whether property rights or whatever it is. So she definitely believes in a state. But I think what you're referring to is the Rothbardian libertarianism is what you're referring to there, which is the idea that you don't necessarily need a state. You can have all of these rights. You can govern society through something like common law, natural justice, and so this is. That is what I subscribe to, but then it's not an original insight by Rothbard. Sort of took the ideas of anarcho capitalism and located them in natural law, taking the principles that have been developed by people like John Locke and just taking them what he saw as this natural conclusion. But the ideas of anarcho capitalism go back even further. If you look at people like Alexander Spooner in the 19th century in the USA, for example. And so I think what has we're not saying that there should be no regulation. What we're saying is that you should only try to resolve conflicts when there is a conflict. You shouldn't try to preempt conflicts when individuals do disagree on something, on how to use property or on how much carbon dioxide should be in the air, for example. That's when you should step in. The conflict resolution body should step in and say, okay, you guys disagree on this. How can we resolve this in a way that makes sense for everyone? That does not prejudice anyone in this involved in this conflict. And so that's what we sort of argue for as anarchists. And in terms of markets,
so free markets do have regulation.
Exactly. So like there would be some
reactive, not proactive.
Yeah, but so basically what would happen is that individuals would decide for themselves what their risks are, what their all of those things, and then they would allocate their funds accordingly. So even for whenever a conflict does arise, they will decide how much they pay towards resolving that conflict, and so on and so on. So it's always up to the individuals themselves involved. No one. Like the system that we propose is radical in one sense, in that it just says what your life is completely your responsibility. No one else has any obligation towards you. You have to convince people if you want them to help you. So it's radical in that way, in the sense that it relies on people actually getting together and working together. It's a harder road. It doesn't take the easy way out and say, okay, we'll just force this guy to do something that is necessary.
Okay. Yeah. Fellas, I must put a pause here because I'm going to do this in two parts. So to you, dear viewer, thank you for keeping up with us so far. I'm going to give you an opportunity to go and get something to drink, refresh your drink, go to the loo, or whatever the case you want to do, as we bring you part two of this debate after this short break.